Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Dr. James Broomall, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Florida and the recent author of We Are a Band of Brothers, Manhood and Community in Confederate Camps and Beyond, which was recently published in the September issue of Civil War History. So, Dr. Broomall, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I deeply appreciate it.
Now, why don't you start us off perhaps with a bit of a general overview of the piece, and if you're willing to, perhaps see how it, or explain to us how it kind of fits into the larger work as you envision it, at least at this moment of your manuscript.
Sure. I might actually answer the latter first, and then I'll get to the former. But I think as I was dissertating, I had really conceived of a project that was focused on the post-Civil War era. And I increasingly found that the men I was looking at weren't necessarily expressing themselves the way I'd expected. They weren't reacting to each other as veterans the way I had assumed that they might. And so I became more invested, I think, in the wartime experiences of white Southern men. And the dissertation sort of took a stab at that, but as I'm now working toward a full-length manuscript, I really have the Civil War situated in the middle of a broader study that looks at kind of the gendered identities and emotional lives of white Southern men, really between the antebellum and postbellum era. And so the Civil War, to me at least, is a transformative period, to many people obviously, it's a transformative period, especially in the ways in which men interacted with one another and the ways in which men interacted with their families. So having said all that then, I was intrigued especially by soldier communities. And so I was looking at men as veterans, but I was also curious, well, did they get along at all when they were serving in the ranks? And I again had kind of assumed that they probably did not, that given everything we know about the honor-based culture of the antebellum South, I didn't necessarily see the possibility for the formation of any sort of meaningful communities during the war itself. But what I found, and what I argue in the piece that you just referred to, is that in fact these very vibrant communities do pop up, composed almost entirely of men. In many cases, men of similar social backgrounds, men from the same geographic area, but nonetheless, a lot of continuity in how they interacted with one another, a lot of like I said, intimacy. And so the article really looks specifically then at their experiences in the military camp. And so while for most men the war is a period of movement, it includes moments of severe violence, it also is a time in which they simply are kind of staying put at the same place for a very long time. So winter quarters, for instance, they could be encamped for 2-3 months at a time, surrounded by the same men day in and day out. And on the one hand, many men, as you might imagine, become kind of repelled by one another because they're simply immersed in this community for so long. On the other hand, they very much come to rely upon one another because of these extended periods in these camps, and they're experiencing very similar conditions, bad weather, cold nights, lack of food, meager clothing, and so on. And in some cases that transcends class, and we can talk more about that later. But suffice it to say that I was very much invested then in that experience, that camp experience, and to see it as a catalyst for change and a catalyst to really understand how these men started conceiving of themselves together. And so the piece focuses primarily on those experiences, and then I give a nod to the post-war era to just suggest that these weren't simply one-offs. This wasn't something that they felt in 1862 or 63, and from that point forward simply dismissed these men, but rather these experiences became kind of central to their identities. And so in the post-war era, as veterans, they continued to write letters to these men that they had known in military camps. They continued to seek emotional support from these men that they had known in military camps. And they continued to think of themselves as kind of, as Bruce Catton said, men set apart, that they were very unique and they were defined very much by these wartime experiences. So I guess that's a kind of quick and dirty overview of the piece and where it fits into the larger project. I guess what I found is, too, that the more I started focusing on the Civil War era, the more I actually want to say about it, which again was really the antithesis of what I wanted to do when I started this project. But now it's very much kind of a centerpiece for everything that I'm doing.
I found it very interesting, and I want to make sure I get this quote correct here, that you note that the model of masculinity that you uncover, that the trend that you notice, I guess, was one that you said was a flexible, pliable model of masculinity, which you point out is a bit somewhat in contrast to some other historians' assessment of masculinity in the South amongst Confederate soldiers, that's perhaps a bit more rigid. So I wondered if you could maybe flesh that out a little bit more for us, and how you saw that and how you envision yourself within the larger kind of historiography on this topic.
Sure. I guess one of the strange things I should note at the beginning here is one of the historians that most deeply influenced how I conceived of Southern manhood and Southern masculinity is, Stephen Barry, of course, and he very much conceived of men in ways that I had never thought possible. And at the same time, though, what he tells us about the inner lives of men, which is so revealing in his book and so exciting, doesn't seem to actually carry over into the wartime era in his estimation, at least. And so I think that he posited a claim that we see among a lot of scholars, and that is that this honor-based culture propelled these men to be fiercely independent during the wartime era itself. And indeed, we do see contests of honor. So most famously, for instance, A.P. Hill is constantly at odds with Stonewall Jackson or James Longstreet, and these are military conflicts, but they're also probably honor-based conflicts. But that is that rigid type of masculinity that you would think all Southern white men embraced. At the same time, though, and Barry is very much part of this conversation, scholars as early as Stephen Stowe and even Bertram White Brown, and more recently Aaron Sheehan Dean and Peter Carmichael, Tim Williams in his dissertation on college-age men from the University of North Carolina, construct these portraits of Southern masculinity that's more restrained, that has multiple dimensions. Men were operating on multiple planes. So, for instance, we know their public lives, for instance, may have been very much defined by this kind of fierce independence. But as Barry argues, their private lives were very much opened to Southern women. And we also know that Southern men interacted with other men in intimate settings like fraternities, like Masonic organizations. They embraced evangelical Christianity and therefore embraced a type of intimacy with other men in those regards too. So we see all these instances in which Southern men depart from that more rigid type of masculinity. And I was reading that type of scholarship when I was working on Southern men during the Civil War era. And so it slowly started pushing me in that direction. And, some of those scholars I've just mentioned, I was fortunate enough to talk to, and they suggested that maybe I re-examine the men that I'm looking at, or re-examine how they're interacting with one another. And so what I found, and what I wasn't expecting, is that they wrote these really revealing letters to deceased family members about a messmate who had died. Or they write in very intimate terms to their wives about the almost love they feel for other men in their military companies, how desperate they are to return actually to the front, to be immersed once again in this homosocial community. And I would never argue that men embraced that community more than they did home and family, which remained paramount. But nonetheless, they understood that they were in probably an unfortunate situation that was partially their own fault for making the crisis begin with, and therefore they had to construct these ad hoc or ersatz families. And they embraced these families to a great extent, I think, throughout the duration of the conflict. And so we see plenty of instances in which men are certainly prickly, and they're certainly fierce, and they're certainly independent, but they also are very open and very revealing. And a lot of this is recorded. Now, there are all sorts of conversations I'm sure occurred on campfires or in the wake of a battle that we'll never have access to, in which they may have been even more emotionally open than they were in some of these letters that we see. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of evidence to really suggest that these men started opening themselves up to other men, not simply to their wives, not simply to their sweethearts, not simply to their mothers or sisters, as we might expect or know, but instead really to other men. And we get at it in a number of different ways, and it's not always a clear picture, but it suggests, to me at least, that masculinity is thus operating on a couple different planes. And that should, again, come as no surprise because people aren't, simplistic. People don't operate generally in binaries, but instead they have an assortment of emotions, an assortment of kind of identities that sometimes compete with one another. So the same individual who, for instance, may have challenged someone to a duel or to a wrestling contest may have also felt a degree of intimacy to another messmate. So we have these two kind of competing types of manhood playing out in the intimate settings of military encampments, for instance. And it's something that I think we need to be very mindful of when we construct these portraits of Southern masculinity, to really understand that these were pretty complex individuals operating in a number of different arenas, emotionally and psychologically.
Now, you rightly point out, and I think it bears further examination here, that early camp life dictated a lot of these relationships and had a deep impact upon many of these soldiers, especially, I would imagine, for instance, prior to really getting into these deep campaigns when there's just a lot of waiting around, so to speak. You've already referenced winter quarters, which is, I'm sure, another dimension to this. But how did the early war kind of camp life settings impact these types of bonds that are forming amongst Confederate soldiers?
Well, I think initially this is a foreign environment. Men who were educated had gone away to college, obviously. Men had experience with militia musters and had experiences away from home. But generally, something on this scale was probably outside the realm of most men's experiences. And so when they first transition into this environment, it is something that's unfamiliar and even kind of frightening. And so initially, I think they're almost repulsed or repelled by what they encounter. They have all sorts of other men they have to deal with, men who may practice vices, who may practice a different type of religion, who may not be religious, who may just simply be disagreeable people. And so they're all thrown together in this environment and forced to kind of figure things out. So initially, I think it's a very difficult transition. What I find, though, is that over time, they become a little more comfortable with this environment, and some even to the point that they almost celebrate the fact that they have kind of given up civilization and the trappings of civilization, and that they've kind of entered this other realm that's closer to some sort of imagined state of being that they want to embrace. And so over time, then, they, again, come to embrace, however reluctantly, these camps and these communities. And it is the conditions therein that I think are so transformative to notions of masculinity. So I was very much interested in camp space as a historical actor, as something that's a significant factor to think about in how these men are interacting with one another, how they're interacting with the military structure. And it is this specific space in which they work that then develops the bonds that I've just discussed. So it is, the fact that they have cold nights. It is the fact that they have meager rations. It is the fact that they're forced to be kind of ingenuitive, and they're forced to make these winter quarters that appear very comfortable and domestic. They're forced into these situations. Again, however reluctantly, they come to some extent to embrace it. And this isn't simply kind of lost cause memoir stuff. This is coming from letters of the period. And in most cases, I was very careful about that. I do have some references to Carleton McCarthy, for instance, who wrote in the 1880s. But by and large, I wanted to find references from 1862, 63, 64, that however much we can gain, offered an authentic expression of how they were interacting with these spaces. And in those instances, they do to some extent almost revel in the privations that they're forced to endure. And it is those very privations, I think, that start to kind of create these soldier communities. So the space itself is a historical actor that's directly shaping their notions of identity, and certainly shaping their notions of masculinity, and certainly how they're conceiving of their individual self in the broader realm of the soldier community or soldier life. But again, I do want to stress, initially they're not thrilled about it. Camps are deadly places. Rates of disease are astronomical in certain camps. And so we can never kind of forget about those really bad conditions. And they certainly talk about that a great deal in their letters too. They're bored. They're tired of being around the same people. They're worried about dying from some sort of disease. All of that is certainly present. But again, in thinking about men on multiple planes, we have to understand not only those conditions and those factors, but the other ones that I've just discussed. So they're interacting with the space in a variety of different ways, and a lot of their letters reflect this fluctuation in mood and character, and almost the identities of them, their self-identities almost kind of change, and that's why they are so fluid in my mind, because they do show these different modes of self in different letters depending upon, in many cases, the physical conditions they're forced to endure. If food's plentiful, if there's a lot of blankets, if they're around people they like, they seem to be a lot happier, morale is good. If there's a lack of food, if they just suffered some sort of military setback, morale is low, they're sick of the camp, they're sick of the environment, they're ready for furlough, they're ready to go back home. And that can change very, very quickly, even by the week in some layers that I've seen. So, something to, I guess, again, to kind of consider in this broader spectrum of masculinity and soldiers' reactions.
Right. Now, another historian that you do mention in the course of your article is Lorian Foote, whose book, The Gentleman and the Roughs, tackles masculinity in the Union Army. And as the title somewhat implies, she treats it, there are two very different types of experiences, be it a proper gentleman's experience of masculinity, more commonly associated with officers, and then the rough and tumble world of those of perhaps a lower class. I wonder, how do you view class impacting these relationships within the Confederate Army based on your studies?
Sure. Well, it's an excellent book, and I tried to use it as a counterpoint at different instances, especially in the footnoting, and I also thought a lot about what she argued when I was working on the article itself. So I'll offer my first giant caveats. The study sample, which isn't really even a study sample, is relatively skewed. And so the men that I focus on most heavily tend to come from a privileged background. Many of them were slaveholders or came from slaveholding families. Many of them were relatively educated. And the reason why I went after these men is, of course, because they wrote a great deal about their experiences. And so scholars like Drew Faust, for instance, have similarly embraced these very specific groups of relatively privileged white elites because, in fact, they do discuss themselves so much, because they do contemplate in diaries and letters their self-identities, and because they do think about these bigger issues. Yeomen were certainly thinking about those same things, but they weren't necessarily recording it. And those recordings that we do have tend to be rather limited. So the group that I'm looking at is relatively privileged and therefore may fall into the gentleman category of that dichotomy. And we gain some glimpse as to their feelings about those of the other social classes. So, for instance, Randolph Shotwell, one of the men I looked at, kind of a contrary guy to begin with, but he certainly is repulsed almost by what he might perceive as common whites or poor whites or yeoman farmers, and so he shuns their company just as they shun his company. He feels as though they're rugged, they're embracing qualities not of someone of his social class, and therefore it's a company that he simply does not want to be around. And so I see those contests playing out, certainly. That said, I've also been very much influenced by the scholarship of Gary Gallagher, Aaron Sheehan Dean, and Joe Glatar especially, who do show a lot of cohesiveness among these men that do demonstrate, especially in Sheehan Dean's statistical study of Virginia, we do see men from all sorts of social strata directly involved in this conflict. Some 95% of Virginia's white male military population is mobilized for the fight. Upwards of 85% of North Carolina is mobilized for the fight. And therefore, there is some dedication to cause and country, and the regiments themselves are going to feature men from across the social strata. Now, of course, the officer class is generally drawn from a very specific social echelon, and the ranks are generally likewise drawn from a very specific social echelon. But we don't see open class warfare as one might expect. We do see all sorts of small contests. There is no doubt about it. Men are pushing back against authority. Men are angered by men who perceive themselves to be social betters, and all sorts of these smaller instances. But there is not open class warfare, at least on the military side of the house. Stephanie McCurry might argue, and she does in Confederate Reckoning, that there is open class warfare on the home front, but we don't see that necessarily in the ranks. All of that said, Fred Bailey's work on Tennessee soldiers is probably one of the best instances we have in which we can sort of get a sense of the voice of the yeoman. Now, that said, Bailey's study sample is drawn mainly from the Tennessee Veterans Questionnaires, which were done in the 1920s. So they're rather dated. They're very much after the fact, but he does show a lot of class antagonism being present during the war itself. And so that dichotomy between the gentleman and the rough may have been very present, and Bailey's work is one of the only studies that we have that demonstrates that. That said, Gallagher conversely argues in the Confederate War that there's not enough compelling evidence to really suggest that the yeomen were that resentful of men from the upper echelons of society, and that, again, there was enough continuity and coherency within regiments to suggest that, at least for some sort of higher cause, they were willing to quell any sort of class tensions and fight as a cohesive unit. And many of these regiments indeed demonstrate incredible fighting abilities that would not be sustainable if there were profound disagreements occurring, every time they got together as any sort of military unit. And I think a lot of people knew that they had to kind of buck up for a time and fall under this larger structure of the military order and see how things played out. Again, I'm not suggesting that necessarily a yeoman and an upper-class individual were best friends, but I'm not finding that type of evidence, but it's partially because of the people that I'm looking at. There's a reason why slaveholders are so fiercely determined to fight this war. I mean, they directly benefit from it. That said, yeomen, by their very whiteness, also benefit from a slave-holding society in the American South. And so they too have a vested interest in the continuation of this social racial order, even if they themselves aren't slaveholders.
I'm glad that you obviously mentioned the slaveholders, which are part of your sample here, exclusively your sample almost for this article, because slaves do accompany masters into camps on some occasions. And you mentioned this, you referenced this in the article, so I wondered if you could elaborate just a bit more in terms of how that factors into the camp situation, because obviously that is something that is uniquely Southern in the sense that these are personal slaves. You do have contraband that are coming into Northern camps, but that's really a different matter. So I wondered how do slaves factor into the relationships that are occurring in Confederate camps?
So here are where some of the contradictions start playing out. So one of the individuals I look at, Ruffin Thompson, writes a letter to his parents in which he proclaims his independence. He's a rough and tumble man now. He's ready to take on the world and live unencumbered with all the clutter of life. And I think literally like 2 or 3 days later, he writes home asking for a slave, a servant. And so, and he indeed gets an enslaved individual named Preston while he's at Fredericksburg in winter quarters. And this experience is relatively typical. Now, the numbers, of course, are difficult to chart, but there are some contemporary sources to suggest, for instance, on the Gettysburg campaign, upwards of 30,000 enslaved African Americans followed the Army into Pennsylvania. And Lee's army at that time, I think, was around 60,000. So this is a massive support network that the Army is utilizing. Many of the individuals that I look at certainly made their lives better through the use of enslaved labor. There is no doubt about it. They had men carry extra baggage. They had men do cooking in some instances. They had men clean clothing. They had enslaved men, do all of these tasks that they deemed they were above. And so they simply brought with them a racial order, an understanding of labor that they had obviously been brought up in the antebellum South, and they simply transplanted it into the wartime era and continued it as much as possible while they were serving in the ranks. And that is where we really do need to understand the contradictions that these men voiced, where on the one hand, they would elevate what they were doing to some sort of lofty position because they felt they were above the trappings of civilization. But on the other hand, they continued to embrace slave labor, and they themselves, not shockingly, were quite racist in their language when they referred to the slave workers, who they saw as being lazy. They saw as being nothing more than childlike Sambos. And we know, in fact, of course, that that could be further anything but the truth. A very different reality emerges. But in order to reinforce that portrait of the so-called Sambo, I reference two lithographs in my work. And as Harold Holzer and Gabor Boritz and Mark Neely show in their book on Confederate images, the sketches showed African Americans actually doing real labor, real work. But in the final print, they're sitting back and enjoying, just a period of relaxation. When in fact, of course, nothing. That's further from the truth. So we see that those elements of the lost cause starting to creep in how Confederates are portraying the use of slave labor, and certainly portraying how slaves themselves conducted themselves in this conflict. But we know from the work of Martinez and others that slave impressment was a huge feature that ensured a lot of the fortifications that Confederate armies used. And we also know that a lot of enslaved servants certainly stayed with the army for the duration of the conflict and did a lion's share of very difficult work. And so any sort of suffering that the men endured, especially among the slave-holding aristocracy, would be somewhat mitigated by the presence of slaves. I don't find in every instance the men that I looked at brought camp servants, brought individuals from home, but we certainly have many instances in which they do so. And that does change the environment quite a bit. And that's where we could perhaps speculate, again, the evidence isn't quite there, of yeomen being quite angry, perhaps, about the conditions that aristocrats were able to create, whereas they were forced to kind of probably endure a much harsher existence in the military without, what they would perceive as the benefit of slave labor. So it's a crucial factor.
Right, and I guess perhaps our final question here, and you're moving us in that direction, which is nice, in reference to some of these yeomen who did not have the luxury, perhaps, of a slave to do their work for them. It forces some of these men into roles that traditionally, at least at home, perhaps would be more in line with female responsibilities. So you have these men and in camp who are taking over roles that they are very unaccustomed to. And I wondered, in your examination and during the course of your research, how you found these men reacting to these new roles that perhaps are not within a traditional realm of masculinity from their antebellum life.
Sure. Well, again, in grad school, I was reading some gender theory, and of course, I'd read the works, of Leanne White's and others as related to gender in the Civil War. And so I was interested in how men were constructing their sense of masculinity, not only in reference to other men, but also in reference to women. And camp life is an instance in which men confront, perhaps for the first time, duties that they had deemed women's work. And initially, I think it's kind of a disaster. So I have lots of letters from guys writing home saying, try to make biscuits. They made us horribly sick. I tried to mend a shirt, and the sleeve is now where the neck's supposed to be. And so they don't do particularly well in these initial domestic responsibilities. Once again, the longer they're at their job, the better they get at it. So by, say, late 62, early 63, they're forced again to continually cook. They're forced to, in some cases, mend clothing. They're forced to do all these things consistently. And they get better at it, and they become quite pleased with themselves. And so they very often write home to a mother or a sister or a wife saying, I have a recipe for you that you would absolutely love, or my biscuits are now better than yours. And in some cases, I think they're kind of condescending. And in other cases, I think they become increasingly sympathetic, actually, to the roles of women. And one individual that I talk about in the article is Hill Fitzpatrick, who writes extensively to his wife Amanda throughout the war. And on the one hand, he tells Amanda, who's at home at Georgia, and they probably can be classified as yeomen, she's going to have to do the work of a man and a woman, and he doesn't appear overly sympathetic. But at the same time, the more he's in this homosocial environment, the more he's deprived of her help, the more I think he comes to appreciate the contributions that she made on a daily basis at home. And I think that forces him to think more about his own construction of masculinity, especially in reference to a woman. And it's also forcing him to think more about the nature of work itself. And so he does become quite good at sewing. He does become quite good at cooking. And I think it gives him an important glimpse into this other realm that previously he might have simply dismissed. So the more thoughtful a man is, I think the more inclined he is to appreciate how much women are constructing his sense of self, and certainly more appreciative of the amount of work that they're forced to do day in and day out. The less thoughtful, I think, are simply resentful of the fact that they have to cook and they have to sew. In some cases, they're going to employ a slave to do it for them. In other cases, they're going to endure as long as they can, but not be very happy about it. But I'm not convinced it necessarily changes any sort of overarching notion of gender identity in their minds. We do see in the post-war period households in flux. We do see family relationships, in some cases, turned upside down. We do see a lot of upheaval related to gendered issues, grounded in the wartime itself. But since that's kind of outside the purview of what I'm doing, I'll just suffice it to say that some seem to become more contemplative, and others, as we might imagine, simply dismiss it as women's work and think nothing more of it. By extension, I might also add, and Drew Faust gives us this insight, men take on emotional qualities that they had in many cases deemed solely the realm of women. And so this is, of course, divorced entirely from the work world. But when men start thinking about their emotional lives, which they do quite a bit, when they start thinking about these inner worlds, as maybe Stephen Barry might deem it, I think, too, they're gaining some insights into gendered constructions, things that they probably didn't think that much about before previously either. And so in that regard, this conflict certainly forces them to reconsider the psychological and emotional world as well, not being strictly divided by sex, but instead being very much constructed by experience.
Well, Dr. Broomall, a pleasure speaking with you today. For everyone out there, I really recommend reading this article. There were probably about twice as many questions as I could have asked in this session right here, but it is a really rich article. I think it challenges the reader to think perhaps a bit differently regarding Confederate camp life and how it contributes to our ideas of Southern and Confederate masculinity during the war era. So, Dr. Broomall, thank you so much for speaking with us. Again, this article is in the September issue of Civil War History, so please pick it up if you haven't already. It's a great journal, so I recommend subscribing if you can. And perhaps we can have you on in the future to talk about the whole manuscript.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward perhaps to a future conversation. So thank you very much.